Would any of you choose this life for yourself? Let me describe it. Your mother dies just as you pass your 3rd birthday. You go into the ministry very reluctantly. In fact, someone has to beg you. You're the pastor in charge, and you're only 27 years old, and this is in a culture where age matters. And you're in a foreign land, and you're in a place where being local, being from the hometown, matters. You don't get paid for the first 8 months of your ministry. And early in your ministry, you get a toothache. And this toothache settles in your gum and gives you an infection. And it's so bad, you can't get out of bed for 9 days. You finally take a triple dose of medicine to get rid of it. Well, after 2 years of strife and conflict with your church, you get voted out. You get kicked out. And you get kicked out of a church that you reluctantly agreed to be the pastor of in the first place. You get married, and your first child, your only child, dies as an infant. Your wife is struck by illness, severe illnesses, through most of your married life, so much so that she's essentially bedridden for almost half of your life together. And just shy of your 10th anniversary, after 9 years of marriage, your wife dies, and you're left standing beside her grave. As you turn 50, you suffer from gout, repeated bouts with intestinal parasites, and you have tuberculosis. The last few months of your ministry, you are in so much pain that you literally have to be carried into the pulpit to preach and then carried home after you're done. And you spend the last painful weeks of your life in bed. And at age 55, you die. Now, I don't think any of us would sign up for that life. And that actually is the life of John Calvin. Now, those aren't all the events that we normally hear about or think about when we think about John Calvin. But remember, we said this back in our first session together, that these reformers were real people, and they knew how to laugh, but they also knew how to weep. And they experienced all of the ups and downs and trials and struggles of life that we experience, and maybe even have far more intense experiences than, by the grace of God, you and I will ever have to experience. Well, this is Calvin. Of course, it's not all of Calvin, so we need to plumb a little bit deeper into what we're dealing with. We start with Calvin, born in France, in the town of Noyon, July 10th, 1509. By this time, Luther, as you remember, has finished up his bachelor's degree back there at Erfurt. This is a year before he takes his trip to Rome, and this is the year of Calvin's birth. We just celebrated last year, or 2 years back, in 2009, the 500th anniversary of Calvin's birth, and everyone was trying to gather at Geneva to celebrate the Calvin. He looked pretty good for being 500 years old, I'd have to say. But here he is, born in 1509. As a young kid, he's sent off to the University of Paris. I think he was about 12 years old when he was sent there to study. And of course, you've got to dismiss from your mind any of these romantic images you might have of going to the University of Paris to study. This was a pretty rough spot where Calvin was, and didn't have all the luxuries that we think of when we think of Paris. But here's where Calvin went to study, and he was intended to be put on a track to end up in the ministry. But as Calvin got into his studies at the University of Paris, he got deeply involved in the humanities, and that seemed to connect with Calvin. And he sort of pushed aside desire and the intentions to go into the ministry, and instead he began to set his sights on an academic career. And Calvin did pretty well for himself, and he took his master's degree and even published a book. He published a book that's a commentary on Seneca. Seneca was a Roman philosopher who had written a book on political philosophy, and Calvin wrote a commentary on that. Now, I don't think it sold. In fact, legend has it that young Calvin would sort of go up and down the streets of Paris and look in at the book-stalls and see the stack there of his book on Seneca's sentences and wonder, how many of those have sold yet? And he wouldn't see the stack go down. So it was a little disappointing for him. But he had his sights all set on a career in academics. But the Reformation ideas started to come to Paris. And in fact, the Reformation ideas even began to affect Calvin's roommate. And through Calvin's roommate, Calvin began to get introduced to the ideas of Martin Luther and began to read about the Reformation. And before you know it, this is Calvin writing much later, that God had turned Calvin's heart around and that God had brought Calvin to himself. That God took Calvin and the trajectory he was headed and turned him around and brought him to himself. And Calvin right away took all that intellectual ability and all of that determination that he had, and he began applying it to his work as a young reformer. Now, Calvin is converted sometime in May of 1534. And within a year later, he writes his second book. In 1535, he writes his second book. Now, he's just a 25-year-old guy, and he hasn't even been a Christian for a full year, and he writes a systematic theology. Now, what were you doing when you were 25 years old, right? And what were you doing your first year of being a Christian, right? So here's Calvin. And in 1535, he writes the first edition of his Institutes of the Christian Religion. Now, the first edition was a pretty small book. And as he lived, he kept adding to it and revising it and adding to it and revising it. And he finally keeps revising it all the way up until the 1550s. And in some ways, we might be glad that he finally did die, because he would have just kept adding to that book and it would have gotten longer and longer and longer. But here he is writing this book, and he actually didn't put his name on it. He came up with a pseudonym. And his pseudonym was Martinus, and that was in honor of Martin Luther. So he took Martin's first name, Martinus Lucianus, which is sort of a rearrangement of the letters of Calvinus. And that was the name that he put on it. And it was published, and it was spread around, and it was a well-respected text. And Calvin's desire was to leave France, where the pressure was significantly on folks of the Reformed persuasion. The Reformation came to Germany, the Reformation came to the Swiss cities. We'll see later that it does come for a brief time in France, but the Reformation never came to France like it did in these other lands. And so Calvin's desire is to leave France, and his desire is to get to Strasbourg. And he wants to get to Strasbourg so that he could study with Martin Bucer. Now, the border up above was a little bit more controlled, so it would be much easier for Calvin to go down to the south and then head up to Strasbourg. And today, Strasbourg is part of France, but back then it wasn't. And that route south took Calvin on a detour through the city of Geneva. And so Calvin shows up in the city of Geneva, and he intends to spend one night there in the city of Geneva. And he spends the night at the home of Guillaume Farel. Now, I used to pronounce his name Farel. Then I found out it was Farel. But then I hear the French pronounce it, and it's something like Farel, which I'm not even going to try, so I'll just call him Farel. He ends up at the home of Guillaume Farel. And Farel's home was just a few houses down from the cathedral, St. Peter's Cathedral there at Geneva. And Farel's a fascinating figure. This was his third time coming to Geneva. He came the first time, tried to bring the Reformation. They literally beat him up and threw him out of the city and told him if he ever came back, they'd beat him up again. He comes back a second time. They beat him up, throw him out of the city, and he comes back again. He comes back a third time, and now God had done a work on their hearts. And now they accepted this message that Farel had brought. But Farel recognized that he had his limitations. He was one of these guys that could sort of mix things up, sort of a fiery guy. He could mix things up, he could get things going, but he knew his limitations. And he knew he just didn't have it within him to actually establish the church that needed to be established there at Geneva. And he recognized something in John Calvin. Now, we've got to give credit where credit is due. At this point in Calvin's life, yes, he's written a book, but he's essentially a nobody. He has no intention, and he's never voiced an intention on being a churchman involved in a pastoral work. He wants the quiet life of a scholar at the University of Strasbourg, working away in his office and lecturing to his students. But Farel recognized that this would be the man that could help establish the church at Geneva. And so he does what any one of you would do if you're trying to get somebody to stay. He convinces Calvin that if he leaves Geneva, Calvin will be bringing down God's curse on his life. I think it went something like this. In the morning, Calvin woke up, he was going to leave, make his way up to Strasbourg, and Farel's standing there, holding a little packed lunch for him, all ready to send him out the door. And just as he hands him his lunch, he says to Calvin, go ahead, have a safe trip, head out the city, turn left, go right, and then just keep going and you'll eventually get there. But, oh yes, by the way, if you leave, you'll bring down God's curses on your life. Now, I don't think Calvin was a superstitious man, and I don't think he believed that God would curse him if he left Geneva. I think what actually happened is Calvin recognized, if this guy is willing to go to this length to keep me here, maybe I ought to look into this. So Calvin stays. What was intended to be an overnight stay in Geneva becomes initially a 2-year stay for Calvin. Now, again, we've got to understand this. Calvin, up to this point, is not indicating that he wants to be in the ministry. Calvin is also an outsider. In fact, for years, in the Geneva City records, they don't even refer to John Calvin by name. They actually refer to him as that Frenchman. That's what they call him, that Frenchman. And he's a young guy. He's only 26, going on 27 years old at this point in his life. So he's a young guy as he's called into this ministry. He is an outsider. Geneva is a French-speaking city, but it's Swiss through, and Calvin's a Frenchman. And here he is to lead the church. Well, Calvin begins his preaching, and he begins to see that things aren't quite right in the city of Geneva. Remember I mentioned to you how they voted to become Reformed, and they stood out there in the town square in front of the church and raised their hand to become a Reformed city? Calvin said, it's not just a question of voting to be Reformed. To be a truly Reformed church means a lot more. It means this gospel that we profess takes root deep in our lives and transforms us. That's what Calvin was after at Geneva. So he began to do a number of things. One of the things he wanted to do was to set up districts in the city and have no more than 50 people be responsible to a pastor. So he had this whole company of pastors under him. And all of these folks under him then, that worked under him as pastors, would be responsible for 50 people so that they could truly shepherd these souls as they grew in their faith. Well, that didn't go over well with the city council. And some of the other things that Calvin proposed didn't go over well either. And we began to see a conflict and a strife between Calvin and Geneva. Well, all of this comes to a head in 1538. And Calvin, on Easter Sunday in 1538, essentially excommunicates Geneva by refusing to give them communion. And 2 weeks later, they return the favor by voting Calvin out. And then they give him 48 hours to leave the city. In a letter just before all this happened, Calvin wrote a letter to Heinrich Bullinger. Remember him? The one successor to Zwingli there back in Zurich. And he told Bullinger that there's a conflict between me and my people, and how this is going to come out, I don't know. He writes this letter back in February, and we know how it turns out. But this is what he says. You could boil it all down to this. The great generality of people want preachers and not pastors. The generality of people in Geneva, they want preachers and not pastors. Now, what's he talking about? See, if we go back and understand the Middle Ages, we understand that when they came to church, all they had was the Mass. That's what they partook of. And when they became Reformed, They wanted to show up at church. They wanted to hear a very inspiring sermon, wonderful, encouraging words, and then they wanted to go home and live their lives. That wasn't what Calvin was about. Calvin was certainly about preaching, but he was also about being a pastor. Now, I think down here in the South, I'm from above the Mason-Dixon line, but I think down here in the South, the word is meddling. See? That when a pastor stops preaching and actually is interested in your life, then he's meddling in your life. See? That's what being a pastor is about. And that's what Calvin was about. And Geneva didn't want that, so they kicked him out. Calvin got his wish. He could finally go to Strasbourg. So he goes to Strasbourg, and there he spends time with Martin Bucer. It's also there that Calvin marries. Now, he marries a woman who's a widow, Idelette de Burr. Her husband had been an Anabaptist leader, and Calvin actually debated him back at Geneva. And Calvin beat him in the debate, and he became Reformed. In fact, I like to put a little twist. To me, history, you might as well make it interesting. So I like to put this little twist on history. What I think happened is Calvin actually fell in love with Idelette, and she was married, so he had to beat her husband so badly in this debate that he would die so then he could marry her. But I don't think that's exactly how it turned out. So that may be apocryphal. But he arrives at Strasbourg, and she's widowed, and he marries Idelette. While it's at Strasbourg, he also starts writing and publishes his first commentary on the Scriptures. And he's going to continue to publish commentaries throughout his life, and once he gets back to Geneva. Well, in Calvin's absence, the Roman Catholic Church flooded back into Geneva to try to take it over again, and there was nobody left that could withstand what the Catholic Church and what the Catholic bishops and priests were teaching. There was nobody who could stand up to them. And the city literally begged Calvin to come back. He writes a letter again to Bullinger, and he says, "There is no place on earth I am more afraid of than Geneva." But he decides to go back. He relents to go back. And he goes back to Geneva. Now, once he agrees to go back, it takes him about 6 months to get there. It was a trip that he could have done in a week. The fact that it took him about 6 months to get there tells me that Calvin is very reluctant and wanting to get back to Geneva. But he goes nevertheless. He returns to Geneva in 1541. He comes back to Geneva with some ground rules. This isn't going to be like the last time. Those things I wanted to be put in play the last time that you bucked at, they're going to be put into play now. And Calvin wasn't given total free rein, but he was given a great deal of concessions, and far more than his first stay there. And as time developed, they stopped calling him that Frenchman and began calling him by name in the town council. Calvin had won them over, and the city of Geneva had become his city. From 1541 until his death in 1564, Calvin preached in Geneva. Calvin lectured at the Academy at Geneva, which then became the university. Calvin had under him what was called the Company of Pastors. And these were all young men in the ministry that worked there in Geneva, were trained, were also sent out. And more than that, and this is one of those untold stories of the Reformation, Calvin turned Geneva into a missionary sending city. While Calvin lived in Geneva, his heart was always towards France. And France was just a stone's throw away from the city of Geneva. It's tucked in right up against the border. And over Calvin's time in the 1540s and 1550s, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 2,000 Frenchmen left France, came to Geneva, studied at the Academy, were funded by Geneva, and sent back into France to plant churches. They planted a whole network of underground churches in France. Records were all kept of this. They were encrypted, kept at Geneva. And they were encrypted because I wasn't sure if the city would fall or not, and if it fell, then all these names would be revealed. And literally, code breakers, military code breakers, had to break these encryptions. And once they finally did, and historians could work with this documentation, finally realized that Calvin had done this all these years. In the 1550s, Geneva even sent missionaries to the shores of Brazil with the gospel. In fact, there's a well-established Presbyterian church in Brazil to this day, and its roots go back to the 1550s of missionaries sent to Geneva. Not only did Geneva send missions out, but Geneva was a city that accepted refugees in. A number of folks from Florence, where the Reformation never took place, never took root, a number of those folks fled to Geneva. And they were particularly skillful jewelers. And much of the time they spent their time down in Florence making icons and elaborate crucifixes. And Calvin thought, well, I don't want you making icons. Why don't you make watches? And they started making watches. Calvin brought watchmaking to Geneva. And then in the 1550s, remember back when we were talking about Lady Jane Grey and Bloody Mary? Well, in the 1550s, you either went into the Tower of London or you left. And they were called Marian exiles. And a number of them, and among them was the Scotsman, John Knox, came to Geneva. Now, Geneva was landlocked and had a big wall around it. That's what made it such a great city, because it was so close to France's border. It had this huge wall. And they have all these refugees, literally hundreds of refugees flooding in the city, and there was no place for them. Well, to show you how the gospel had taken root, you know what the city of Geneva did? And you see this, if you walk through the old city, you can see this. Since they couldn't expand out, they went up. They actually took the roof off their house and added a floor so they could put refugees up there. And you see it as you walk through the old house. You'll see like 4 stories that are contiguous, and the 5th story doesn't match at all. Different windows. And in the 1550s, all through Geneva, took the roof off of their houses so they could put Scottish refugees up there during Mary's reign of terror. When John Knox came to Geneva, he called Geneva the perfect school for the character of Christ. And he was committed to go back to Scotland and do for the whole nation of Scotland what Calvin had done at Geneva. So their missionary work, their work literally with refugees, all of this was happening, not to mention writing of the Institutes, not to mention writing letters. Calvin's correspondence was immense, and he touched on all princes and government officials would write Calvin for advice, and he would answer back to them. All sorts of ministers would correspond with Calvin asking for advice, and he would write back to them. Not only that, he was essentially the head of a denomination there at Geneva, as Geneva was the center for the Reformed Church. So Calvin is carrying on all of this. What's interesting as we look at Calvin's thought, and as we look at his life, we could tell many more stories about it, and as we look at his thought, we could land on any number of ideas with Calvin. He talked about justification just like Luther did. He talked about Scripture just like Luther and the other reformers did. He talked about the knowledge of God. But one of the things that Calvin talks about, and it's truly, I think, a hallmark doctrine of Calvin's, is what we call union with Christ, the doctrine of union with Christ. Now, the doctrine of union with Christ has to do with the work of Christ in providing for our salvation, and that as we are united with Christ in His work, we then become joint heirs with Christ. So the work of Christ, or the union with Christ, does have to do with the doctrine of the work of Christ. But it also has to do with the person of Christ. Remember, we started off with this litany of all these events that Calvin suffered in his life. Well, as we think about Christ, we recognize that Christ knew a little bit about suffering too. We recognize that Christ knew about human frailty, that Christ knew about weakness. In fact, we read this, don't we, in the book of Hebrews? For we do not have a high priest who was unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. The Reformers not only took us to Scripture, they also took us to Christ alone. Remember Luther? Help me, St. Anne. Well, here we are a few decades later, and we don't need a saint. We can go straight to Christ alone, our sympathetic high priest, We can draw to the throne in confidence. And that's what marked Calvin's life. And that's at the essence of Calvin's theology. Well, we have one more sola to do, the last sola. And we'll catch it in our next session, Soli Deo Gloria.